3 girls vanished. 1 was never reported. 1 left behind a diary. And 1, she never even had a name. They said they ran away. But the truth was hidden beneath a chapel for over 40 years. This is the story they tried to erase, and the girl they buried without a name. Before we start, hit subscribe to support the channel and help uncover stories that were never meant to be found. The wind scraped dry leaves across the gravel as Rachel Elwood pulled her rental car to a stop in front of the gates of Greystone Academy. The wrought iron arch still bore the school's faded Latin motto, Sapientia et Silentium. Wisdom and silence. It was a fitting phrase, she thought grimly, for a place abandoned for over a decade. She stepped out of the car and tightened her coat against the sharp October chill. The trees along the old stone wall still clung to bursts of autumn color, though most had already shed their leaves, revealing skeletal branches reaching toward the overcast sky. The buildings loomed ahead, Victorian, gray-stoned, and solemn. The demolition crews wouldn't arrive for another month, which gave her just enough time to do her job, document and catalog any materials of archival value before the wrecking ball did its work. Rachel had been here before, but only once, and not as an archivist. That memory, though blurred by time and trauma, still lived somewhere behind her ribs. She had been a student at Greystone for exactly 1 semester in 1997. Her mother had pulled her out with no explanation, and no one ever spoke of it again. Now, 28 years old and recently laid off from her museum job in Boston, Rachel had accepted the private contract from the school board partly for the money, and partly to answer the questions no one in her family had ever dared to. She signed in with the site supervisor, a gruff man named Keller, who spent most of his days inside a heated trailer scrolling through job listings. "Don't go into the chapel," he warned her without looking up. "There's structural damage, and the 3rd floor's sealed, black mold." "I'll stay where it's safe," Rachel said. He didn't ask what she was looking for, and she didn't offer. Inside, the air was colder than outside. She wore gloves, but could still feel the chills seeping through her boots as she walked down the main hall, past trophies covered in sheets of dust, portraits of stern headmasters, and dark-paneled walls lined with empty hooks where student banners used to hang. She headed toward the library first. Of all the school's buildings, it had weathered the past decade best. Rows of oak shelves still stood firm, and the windows, though fogged with grime, let in enough daylight to cast dim golden beams across the stacks. Rachel opened her satchel and removed a digital camera, a notebook, and a fresh folder labeled Greystone, Archive Sweep. The books were nothing remarkable. Outdated science texts, dusty classics, and student yearbooks. She flipped through a few, noting the inscriptions in the front covers. To Natalie, "Don't forget who you are. Love, Ms. Krause." Ben, "You'll be a great lawyer someday." Small, human touches in an otherwise cold space. Then she noticed it. In the far corner of the library, behind an overturned chair and a collapsed shelf, was a section of the wall that looked wrong. The bricks didn't match. They were newer, cleaner, and arranged slightly unevenly. Rachel crouched and ran her gloved fingers along the edge. Someone had clearly bricked up a portion of the wall, but not professionally. It looked like a rushed job, and the mortar was already cracking in places. She stood, hesitated, then retrieved the small crowbar from her equipment bag. It had been meant for opening crates, not walls. But when she wedged it between 2 bricks and leaned in, the brick gave way with a soft groan. It took 20 minutes and considerable sweat, but eventually Rachel cleared a small opening and peered inside. It wasn't a hallway. It was a room, a hidden room. She widened the gap just enough to squeeze through. The space beyond was small, maybe 8 by 8 feet, and pitch dark except for the faint light leaking through the hole she'd made. The air was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and paper rot. There was only one item inside, a small, square desk. Rachel's heart thudded harder as she approached it. The desk was wooden, chipped, and covered in a thin layer of dust. But what made her stop was the object sitting neatly on top of it, a leather-bound diary. She picked it up carefully. The cover was cracked with age, and the name etched on the inside front page read, Vivien Locke. Winter term, 1979. Rachel's breath caught. Vivien Locke. The name itched at her memory. She had heard it before, in whispers or newspaper clippings. A girl who had gone missing during a snowstorm in 1979. One of the great unspoken tragedies of Greystone. Officially, the file said, ran away. But the students in town had always believed otherwise. And now her diary was here. Rachel set it gently into her satchel, as if afraid it might disappear if she blinked. She turned to leave but paused as the light caught a glint of metal beneath the desk. She knelt and reached under. A rusted pendant lay on the ground, shaped like a small keyhole. No chain, no explanation. She pocketed it. That night, in the rented cottage just outside town, Rachel sat at the kitchen table and opened the diary. The first entry was dated January 8th, 1979. They told me I'm not allowed to talk about what happened on Christmas Eve. But I don't care. If someone finds this, maybe they'll believe me. Maybe they'll know I didn't run away. Not yet. Something is wrong at this school. It started in the chapel. I heard her singing again last night. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. The handwriting was tight and careful, but the tone felt panicked beneath the neatness. They say she doesn't exist. But I saw her. I swear, I saw her. She was standing behind the altar when the candles went out. She whispered my name. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The chapel. The one Keller said not to enter. Coincidence? She flipped ahead several entries. Miss Harker gave me detention again for being delusional. That's what she calls it. But I saw Natalie's schedule. She's been taken out of morning chapel. That's how it starts. They take you out of chapel, and then you disappear. I think they're watching me. I think someone is reading this diary. If I go missing, I didn't leave. I didn't run. I never would have left Emiline. Rachel closed the book. Emiline. That name wasn't familiar. Another student? She opened her laptop and began searching local records. There were news articles about Vivien's disappearance, but none mentioned another missing girl named Emiline. No death records, no transfer files, nothing. She slept fitfully that night, her dreams full of creaking floorboards and faint voices humming old hymns. When she awoke, she was gripping her phone like it was a lifeline. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering dead leaves across the porch. Something tapped against the window once. Then again. Rachel walked to the door and looked out. A single ivy vine, deep green despite the cold, was creeping across the gravel. Toward her cottage, the morning sun filtered weakly through Rachel's kitchen window, catching motes of dust in the air and dancing across the edge of Vivien Locke's diary. It sat exactly where she had left it the night before, its cover now slightly warped from the damp air that clung to everything in the small town. The smell of mildew was faint but constant, Greystone's quiet gift that followed her home. Rachel stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her eyes on the front page of her notebook where she jotted bullet points. Vivien Locke, 1979, presumed runaway. Mentions another girl, Emiline, no school record found. Claims someone whispered her name in the chapel, reports being watched. And at the bottom, the chapel is off limits. Why? She circled that last sentence. Then she glanced at the pendant she'd found. Keyhole-shaped, small enough to fit inside a locket, maybe. It was tarnished and rough to the touch. It didn't look valuable, but it had clearly meant something to someone. Her fingers hovered over her phone, debating whether to call the local records office again. She'd already left one message. The woman who answered the landline had sounded like she'd been disturbed from a nap. Instead, Rachel grabbed her satchel and zipped the diary inside. It was time to go back. By late morning, the fog had settled over Greystone like a heavy curtain. The gravel crunched under her boots as she passed through the courtyard. Her breath came out in puffs. A flock of birds scattered from the roof of the east dormitory as she passed. Inside the main building, the atmosphere felt heavier. She paused at the foot of the stairwell, looking up at the third floor, which was still cordoned off with yellow tape and a hand-lettered sign, "Mold, do not enter." Maybe later. She turned toward the west wing. The chapel was at the end of the hall, past the music rooms. Most of the hallway lights no longer worked. Her flashlight beam skimmed across faded murals of saints and scripture quotes in Latin. When she reached the arched wooden doors of the chapel, she expected a padlock or barrier. There was nothing. Just a faint smear of white paint over the doorknob, likely from someone marking it for demolition. Rachel hesitated. Vivien Locke had mentioned seeing someone there, hearing a voice whisper her name. Rachel didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But she did believe in stories buried under silence. She pushed the door open. The chapel was cold, vast, and still. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows depicting saints and angels. Their eyes faded with time. The wooden pews were intact, but covered in layers of dust. At the far end stood the altar, ornate, though rotted at its base. A faded velvet cloth hung unevenly over it. Rachel stepped inside and let the door close behind her. Silence. She took a few tentative steps forward. Her boots echoed faintly on the stone floor. There was no sign of structural collapse, but the far right side of the chapel had a section of boarded windows and discolored walls. Water damage, probably. She began scanning the space with her phone's camera, clicking photos as she went. Then she noticed the small door behind the altar. It was almost hidden by the drapery and positioned lower than usual, as though leading to a crawl space or storage area. A brass handle protruded from the middle. She crouched beside it and tried it. Locked, but the handle had something carved into it. A keyhole. Small. Unusual. Rachel's pulse quickened. She reached into her satchel and retrieved the pendant. She held it up to the keyhole. A perfect fit. With a small twist, something inside clicked. She pulled the door open. A narrow passage lay beyond, dusty and steeped in shadow. The air smelled older, damper. A maintenance stairwell, maybe? She turned on her flashlight. The stairs led downward, into what seemed like an older part of the foundation. As she descended slowly, her light revealed stone walls, worn and stained by time. The passage turned once, then opened into a rectangular room. Rachel stepped inside. It was bare. Stone floor, stone walls, no windows. But what struck her was the writing, etched into the stone with what looked like a nail or piece of metal. Names, dozens of them. Vivien, Emiline, Natalie, Sarah. Others, some partially scratched out, others circled. And beneath it all, in trembling scrawl, "No one leaves unless they're forgotten." Rachel backed away slowly. Her hand brushed the wall and came away smeared with black mold. She turned quickly and hurried back up the stairs, heart hammering in her chest. She closed the hidden door behind her and stepped away from the altar, suddenly aware of how still the chapel remained. Then her phone vibrated. She fumbled it out of her coat pocket. One new voicemail from the town records office. She pressed play. "Yes, hi. Miss Elwood, this is Jeanette at the town hall. You were asking about a girl named Emiline. I think you should come in. There's no school record, but we did find a birth certificate and an unfiled death report. No official cause. It was never finalized. Just a note. Family declined inquiry. One more thing, the document says Emiline Locke. Was that the name you gave me? Because it seems she and Vivien were sisters. Rachel sat in her car outside the Mornington Town Hall, staring at the pale brick facade without moving. The voicemail replayed in her head on a loop. Emiline Locke. She and Vivien were sisters. Two sisters. One missing, the other forgotten. The name Emiline hadn't appeared in any school files. Not in the yearbooks she'd skimmed. Not on the student rosters she'd photographed. And yet, the woman from records had found a birth certificate and an unfiled death report. A ghost in the paperwork. Rachel stepped out of the car and walked up the stairs to the building. Inside, a bell chimed over the front door. The place smelled like dust and toner. A receptionist with silver-streaked hair looked up from her crossword puzzle. "You're Rachel Elwood?" "Yes. From the Greystone Project. Come with me." She led Rachel to a back room where 2 manila folders waited on the table. The receptionist sat down, folded her hands. "I didn't say this on the message, but I was a student at Greystone myself. Class of '83. Vivien Locke was a few years ahead of me. Everyone talked about her when she disappeared." "You knew her?" "Not well, but I remember her. Tall, quiet, smarter than most." "And Emiline?" She opened the first folder. She was listed on Vivien's birth certificate. Twin sister, born 3 minutes apart. Rachel leaned in. The document was faded, but intact. Vivien Locke and Emiline Locke, born February 3rd, 1962. Mother, Clara Locke. Father, unknown. They weren't identical, but they were always together, until they weren't. "And the death report?" Rachel asked quietly. The receptionist slid the second folder forward. "Unfiled, never signed by a medical examiner, no autopsy, just a note from the school board attorney at the time. Incident deemed closed at family's request. Dated March 12th, 1979. Just 2 months after Vivien's last diary entry. "I also found this," the woman added, opening a drawer. "School property inventory. Before they shut the building down, they did a clearance list. One of the line items in the basement storage reads, L recordings, chapel interviews /1979. Could be audio, could be VHS. Rachel looked up. "Still at the school?" She shrugged. "Probably buried in a box somewhere. But the chapel basement did have a storage annex. The blueprints call it a holding archive. It's not on the main student access map. It was used for private materials, disciplinary cases, board records." Rachel nodded slowly. The hidden staircase, the stone room, the scratched names. They had used it. She thanked the woman and left the office, folders in hand. Her thoughts raced as she crossed the sidewalk and climbed back into her car. She needed to talk to someone who had been at Greystone during that time. Someone who hadn't disappeared or been silenced. By late afternoon, Rachel stood at the edge of a wooded cul-de-sac just outside of town, where old faculty housing had been converted into private residences. She rang the doorbell of the last cottage, the nameplate beside it still etched in brass. M. Harker Margaret Harker had been the school's literature teacher for over 30 years. Rumor had it, she was one of the last active faculty to resign before the school closed. Rachel adjusted her satchel on her shoulder as the door opened a crack. "Yes?" "Ms. Harker, my name is Rachel Elwood. I'm cataloging records at Greystone for the Historical Board. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about 1979. The woman on the other side was in her 70s, hair white but neatly brushed, her eyes sharp and clear. She studied Rachel for a long moment before opening the door wider. I suppose it was only a matter of time. Inside, the house was tidy and sparse. Books lined the shelves, most of them classics and annotated volumes. A tea kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. "You knew Vivien Locke?" Rachel asked after a moment. "I taught both Locke girls," Harker replied, pouring water into 2 mugs. "Vivien and Emiline. Identical names on attendance sheets, but completely different children. Vivien was thoughtful, reserved. Emiline had an imagination that got her into trouble." What kind of trouble? Harker handed Rachel a cup of tea and sat across from her. She believed things no one else could see. Said there were voices in the chapel. Said the priest, Father Raymond, made her lie about things. Her parents didn't believe her. Neither did the board. Rachel's stomach turned. What happened to her? She died, Harker said flatly. At least, that's what they told us. You didn't believe it? No, Harker said after a pause. I believed she was locked away. Maybe not literally, but kept out of sight. I think Vivien knew it too. After Emiline vanished, Vivien stopped speaking for days. Then she started writing. The diary. Yes. Harker's eyes sharpened. You found it. Rachel nodded slowly. Behind a bricked-up wall in the library. She said she was being watched. She said something about chapel interviews. Harker sighed and looked away. The board did something that year. There were rumors of corrective therapy. I don't know what they did down there, but it wasn't teaching. I tried to ask questions. I was told to focus on my classwork or retire. So I did. And now... The woman looked at Rachel with a tired, bitter smile. I've lived long enough to know that truth only comes out when it's inconvenient for someone. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out the keyhole-shaped pendant. Does this look familiar? Harker inhaled sharply. Where did you get that? It was under the desk in the hidden room, the one with the name scratched into the wall. I gave that to Emiline, Harker whispered. She wore it to chapel every day. She said it made her feel safe. Rachel stared down at the pendant, her pulse quickening. There's more, isn't there? She asked. Tapes. Something recorded. Go to the chapel annex, Harker said. The school kept a cabinet back there. If the building hasn't eaten it, you might find what's left. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She sat at the small table in her rental cottage. The diary opened to a torn page near the end. He asked me again if I remembered what happened. I told him I didn't. But that was a lie. I remember everything. I remember Emiline screaming in the chapel. I remember Miss Harker crying when they took her away. And I remember what he whispered when the lights went out. No one leaves unless they're forgotten. Rachel turned the page. I think he wants me to disappear too. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the diary. Outside, the wind was rising. Ivy scratched softly at the window. Tomorrow, she would go back. The sky was already bruising with morning light when Rachel arrived at Greystone. Her flashlight beam cut through the mist as she made her way across the courtyard, past the broken benches and rusting bike racks. The main hall echoed with every step she took. She didn't stop in the library today. She didn't pause at the dormitory wing or glance at the old classroom chalkboards. She was going straight to the chapel. And deeper. Rachel approached the altar with purpose, kneeling to unlock the small hidden door with the keyhole pendant. The mechanism clicked with a soft, almost reluctant sigh. She ducked through the passageway again, down the narrow steps that led to the old stone room. But this time, she noticed something new. To her left, part of the wall was lined with narrow slats, wooden, warped, but unmistakably part of a cabinet unit, partially embedded in the masonry. Her flashlight caught on a small brass handle. She pulled. It stuck at first, swollen from years of damp air. She yanked harder and the panel finally gave way with a groan, revealing an open cabinet cavity, about chest high, with several shelves inside. On the top shelf, still intact despite decades of dust and decay, were 4 cassette tapes in faded plastic cases, each one labeled with white stickers in the same neat typewritten font. Chapel Interview, Lock. Chapel Interview, Lock V. Observational Notes, February 13th, 1979. Final Interview, FR. Confidential. Rachel exhaled shakily and reached for the tapes. Beneath them lay a notebook with cracked leather binding. On the cover, Greystone Student Psychological Logs. Spring Term, 1979. She cradled the items in her arms like they were holy relics. Back at the cottage, Rachel didn't even take off her coat before setting up her old tape recorder, something she'd brought from Boston to document oral histories. She inserted the first tape. Chapel interview, Lock E. There was a hiss of static, then a click. A woman's voice spoke first, calm and clinical. Session 3, February 5th. Interview with Emiline Locke. Present are myself, Nurse Diane Welland, and Father Raymond. Then a softer voice. A girl, no older than 17. Why do you keep asking me the same questions? I already told you I heard her voice. And what did the voice say, Emiline? She said to stay away from the chapel. That something bad happened there. Emiline, these stories you tell, they concern the staff. They sound like projections. Fantasies. They're not stories. You know what's down there. And what would that be? A long pause. The room with the scratched names, the one you keep locked. She screamed in there. I heard her. I know what you did to her. Click. End of tape. Rachel stared at the machine. She felt hollow. She reached for the second tape. Tape 2. Chapel interview. Locke, V. Session 4. Interview with Vivien Locke, March 2nd. Vivien, you've been quiet since your sister's departure. She didn't leave. You took her. Your parents believe she had a psychological episode. You're under stress. It's understandable. Stop telling me how I feel. The tape crackled, and then came the priest's voice. Smooth, condescending. Vivien, if Emiline were truly in distress, wouldn't it be better for her to receive help? Surely you understand this wasn't punishment. It was protection. You said the same thing before she vanished. And you're safe now, aren't you? You're afraid of the chapel. You're afraid of her voice. Silence. Then Vivien whispered, she said she was going to make you remember what you buried. Click. Rachel sat back, blood roaring in her ears. Buried. Her thoughts returned to the etched names, to the mound of discolored earth in the corner of the stone room. The one she'd assumed was just sunken flooring. She pressed play on the third tape. Tape 3. Observational Notes. February 13th, 1979. No interview, just notes. Subject EL continues to show dissociative symptoms, escalating to periods of silence lasting more than 12 hours. She speaks of visions, the girl in the walls, and names written in bone. She's fabricated a narrative in which she and her sister are being watched by non-existent staff figures. Requests to discontinue chapel therapy were denied. Per Father Raymond, the program must continue until subject EL recants or is withdrawn by the family. Observation team recommends sedation next session. Rachel stopped the tape. No wonder the death report was never filed. They weren't treating Emiline. They were erasing her. The final tape was shorter, barely 30 seconds. Final interview. FR, confidential. Father Raymond's voice. Locke girls are more trouble than expected. One vanished, the other turned defiant. This must not reach the board. We're not built for this kind of scrutiny. If anyone asks, they ran. That's all they do. Run. Memory fades faster than records, especially when no one wants to keep them. Click. Rachel sat in the stillness, hands clenched. She thought of Vivien's diary, the scratched names, the whispers no one believed. She thought of Emiline, whose voice had been taped, silenced, boxed in a cabinet underground. And still, somehow, heard. That evening she returned to the stone room. The sun had begun to set behind the trees, casting long shadows through the chapel's stained glass. She brought gloves, a trowel, and a flashlight. She knew what she was looking for now. The floor of the stone room had one uneven corner, slightly raised, the dirt darker and softer. Rachel crouched and began to dig. 6 inches down, the trowel hit wood. A rotting wooden box about the size of a drawer. She pried it open. Inside were old notebooks, a cloth doll with missing eyes, and a stack of folded letters. all addressed to E.L., most signed V. She reached for the first letter. I can't find you. I ask them every day, and they say you're gone. But I know you're not. I heard you last night in the chapel. Your voice. You said, tell them the truth. So I will. I will keep writing until someone reads this. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I won't stop trying. V. Rachel folded the letter back into the box and held it to her chest. Then she turned off the flashlight. And just for a moment, in the silence of the stone room, she swore she heard a girl's voice, soft and clear. Thank you. The sun was still low when Rachel returned to town hall the next morning, the box of tapes and documents carefully packed in her satchel. She hadn't slept. The whisper, imagined or not, had anchored itself in her thoughts like a nail in old wood. Inside, Jeanette, the records clerk, looked up with wide eyes as Rachel walked in. I found them, Rachel said, voice quiet but clear. Tapes, notes, letters, interviews Jeanette motioned for her to follow. They sat in the same back room, a dusty fan chugging weakly in the corner. Rachel pulled the box from her bag, laid the contents out on the table one by one. The tapes, the cloth doll, the letters. I need to make this official, she said. I don't care what the board wants. This isn't just school history. It's a criminal cover-up. Jeanette examined the tapes, her mouth tight. Father Raymond, he passed a few years ago. Died in Oregon. No record of charges ever being filed. Rachel wasn't surprised. What about Nurse Welland, or the school board members from '79? I can try to dig, Jeanette said, but you're going to hit walls. Most of this was swept under. I want a full copy of Vivien and Emiline's files, every record, even the ones they forgot to file. Jeanette gave a slow nod. I'll help, but if you're really going to do this. She gestured toward the tapes. You need a platform. This isn't going to live in a footnote. Someone has to see it. Rachel looked down at the letter signed V. I won't stop trying. She stood. I know someone who can help. 2 hours later, she knocked on the door of a cottage on the far edge of town. Margaret Harker answered again, wrapped in a cardigan and holding a mug of tea. Back so soon? I found the tapes. Harker stepped aside without a word. They listened together in the parlor, surrounded by dusty books and framed certificates. Harker said nothing during the first 2 tapes. But when Vivien's voice cracked on the second tape, she said she was going to make you remember what you buried. Harker covered her mouth with her hand and looked away. Vivien gave me a notebook once, she said quietly. After Emiline vanished, she said, if something happens, keep it safe. I never looked inside. I was afraid. She left the room and returned a moment later with a sealed envelope, yellowed and cracked. Rachel opened it carefully. Inside was a composition notebook. Pages filled with drawings, timelines, scraps of poetry, even taped-in letters. On one page, a map. A crude drawing of the chapel, the secret room, and the crypt. Another showed sketches of names scratched into the walls, the same ones Rachel had seen. At the very back was a poem, scrawled in jagged handwriting. She sang in the chapel, where no one believed, the girl with no record, the one never grieved. They buried her name and erased her face, but she waits in the quiet, in that cursed place. Rachel's hands trembled. She documented everything, she said. She was terrified, Harker replied, but she was also determined. You're the first person who's ever followed the trail. Rachel looked up. Will you help me bring this to the board? I'll testify. I'll sign whatever statement you want. But don't trust them to do the right thing, not unless the public sees it too. That night, Rachel drafted a letter. To Vermont Department of Education. Subject, formal inquiry. Greystone Academy. Student deaths, 1979. Attached, audio recordings of chapel interviews with Vivien and Emiline Locke's psychological observation reports from 1979, witness testimony from former faculty member Margaret Harker, unfiled death report for Emiline Locke. Personal letters and documented timeline burial location under Chapel Annex, requesting formal investigation into wrongful death, falsified records, and institutional abuse. Please confirm receipt. Rachel Elwood, Historical Research Consultant, Mornington Preservation Board, contracted. She attached a copy of the folder and hit send. Then she opened a clean document and began writing something else. A story. One without footnotes or institutional formatting. A narrative. A girl who disappeared. Another who fought to remember her. A school that chose silence over truth. The next morning, she arrived at Greystone for what she intended to be the last time. The morning was unusually still, and for a moment, she stood at the edge of the courtyard, just listening. She walked slowly through the hall, past the muraled walls, the dusty library, and the bricked wall that once hid a diary, down the chapel steps, into the stone room. She stood at the spot where the box had been buried. She placed a small placard on the wall, wrapped in protective laminate, in memory of Emiline, 1962 to 1979, silenced, forgotten, found. May your voice echo louder than the ones who buried it. Then, finally, Rachel stood in the chapel's stained glass glow, looking up at the faces of saints. For once, they seemed to be watching her back. 3 days passed before the school board responded. The email came without fanfare, just a plain text message in Rachel's inbox, tucked between newsletters and automated bills. Subject: Inquiry into Historical Materials, Greystone, Ms. Elwood. Thank you for forwarding your findings. We are currently reviewing the material. Given the sensitive nature of the documentation, we have referred the matter to legal counsel for evaluation and appropriate response. At this time, we request that you refrain from further publication or disclosure of this material until our review is complete. Board of Trustees, Mornington Educational Trust. Rachel stared at the message. It was polite, it was vague, and it was a threat. She forwarded the email to Jeanette and Margaret Harker with a single line beneath. They want me to be quiet. Jeanette called 5 minutes later. That's their way of warning you, but they can't touch you, Rachel, not if you go public. I'm not afraid, she said, and meant it. But she also hadn't slept. Maybe not, Jeanette said, but I'd still watch your back. Rachel looked at her wall, where she'd pinned a printout of the scratched names, Vivien's sketches, and copies of the diary entries. It wasn't a conspiracy board, but it was close. She clicked open her blog draft. Title: She Didn't Run. What Greystone Tried to Bury. By Rachel Elwood. For over 4 decades, the disappearance of Emiline was quietly explained away by officials as a runaway case. No autopsy, no investigation, no closure. But Emiline didn't run. I've found the tapes, the records, the personal letters. I've spoken to the people who were there. And now, after 46 years, it's time we listen to what was never meant to be heard. She hit publish. The story exploded overnight. By noon, regional news outlets were calling. By evening, the article had been shared over 10,000 times. Journalists, podcasters, cold case researchers, even former students of Greystone began chiming in online. Some posted old class photos. Some remembered Emiline, quiet, pale, always drawing. Others said they had forgotten her entirely until reading the name. That night, Rachel received an anonymous message. They're going to try and make this go away again. Be careful where you walk alone. She stared at it for a long time, then deleted it. The next morning, the board released an official statement. While we acknowledge that material from the 1979 term has surfaced, the Board of Trustees wishes to clarify that these records do not reflect the current mission or operations of the Mornington Educational Trust. The leadership at that time is no longer associated with the institution, and many key individuals are deceased. We are cooperating fully with local authorities in any historical investigation. We ask that the public respect the privacy of families involved as we undertake this sensitive review. Rachel read the statement 3 times. It was careful, sanitized, and empty. But the story had already caught fire. And then came the message she hadn't expected. Vivien Locke. Message request. The notification stopped her cold. She clicked without hesitation. Hi, my name is Ruth. I'm Vivien's daughter. She passed away in 2012. I've been going through her things lately. I found her journal, the names, the sketches, the chapel. I thought she was writing fiction. But now I see your article. I want to help. I think she meant for someone to know. I think she meant for someone like you. Rachel stared at the message. She reread it twice. Vivien had kept documenting. Even after leaving Greystone. Even after silence. 2 days later, Rachel met Ruth Locke in a cafe outside of Boston. Ruth was in her early 30s, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and dark eyes. She brought with her a cardboard box filled with notebooks and letters. Vivien's private archive. Rachel helped her sort them for hours. She never talked about her sister, Ruth said. Only in little ways. A song she liked. A nickname she used for me, Em. I always thought it was short for Emma. Rachel opened one notebook. At the top of the page, they took her because they could. But they didn't count on memory being louder than silence. Later that evening, as Rachel drove back toward Mornington, her phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Harker. She answered on speaker. Rachel, the older woman said, voice tight. The demolition has been moved up. What? It wasn't scheduled for another 2 weeks. They posted signs today. Hazard notice, asbestos scare. They're sealing the campus by Monday. Rachel gripped the wheel tighter. They're going to destroy the chapel. Yes. Then I need to get back in before they do. Don't go alone, Harker warned. They've buried this before. They'll do it again. That night, Rachel parked at the edge of the Greystone woods. The gates were locked. The signs posted. But she knew the old gardener's trail, the one that curved through the trees and led behind the chapel. She hiked it under moonlight, the satchel on her shoulder, a flashlight in one hand. She reached the stone building just before midnight. The front doors were chained. But the back door cracked open. Rachel stepped inside. The air smelled different now, like paint thinner and dust. Someone had been here, and then she saw it. The stone room below the chapel had been cleared out, the names on the wall scrubbed with acid wash. The burial spot? Empty. The placard she'd left behind? Gone. Only one thing remained. A slip of paper nailed to the wall with a single pushpin, in crooked black marker. She didn't run. She's still here. You're next. Rachel didn't sleep. She didn't go home. Instead, she sat in her car on the side of the narrow road that wound behind Greystone's property, headlights off, fingers trembling slightly around a thermos she couldn't bring herself to open. The note still sat on the passenger seat beside her, its thick black handwriting taunting her. She didn't run. She's still here. You're next. She'd taken photos of the chapel before leaving, walls freshly scrubbed, the names scraped away. The burial site disturbed. The placard she'd installed in Emiline's memory, gone, not stolen, removed. Like the record of Emiline's life. Again. It wasn't just institutional neglect anymore. Someone was still watching, still invested, and that meant someone who had been there in 1979 was still alive, and still covering their tracks. The next morning, Rachel met Jeanette at town hall. They spoke in hushed tones. Are you absolutely sure no one outside the board had access to those records? Rachel asked. Jeanette didn't answer immediately. Then she said, There's one name that keeps coming up in old maintenance logs. Not a teacher, not clergy, just listed as grounds and repairs. She handed over a photocopy from a personnel record. Name, Franklin H. Merritt. Role, maintenance supervisor, 1965 to 1990. Last known address, Mill Creek Apartments, number 102, Mornington. Note: requested continued access to facilities post-retirement. Request granted for chapel keys only, 1990 to 1993. Rachel stared at the note. He had access to the chapel? For 3 years after retirement. Is he still alive? Jeanette nodded slowly. If he is, he's one of the last who would have had unrestricted access back then. Rachel didn't hesitate. Mill Creek Apartments had seen better decades. The complex sagged in the way buildings only do after long, slow decline. Half-maintained paint, rusted balconies, a community board thick with yellowing notices. She knocked on the door of Unit 102. A long pause. Then, "Who is it?" "Mr. Merritt, my name is Rachel Elwood. I'm working with the Preservation Board. I'd like to ask you about Greystone Academy." Silence. She heard the deadbolt click, but the door didn't open fully, just a narrow crack. A single bloodshot eye peered out from behind the chain. "Greystone's gone." "Not yet." He didn't answer. "I know what happened to the Locke sisters," Rachel said quietly. "I know about the interviews. The room under the chapel. I found the tapes." Another pause. A long one. Then the door closed. Chain slid. When it opened again, she saw a man in his late 80s. Thin, slightly hunched, but sharp-eyed despite the tremor in his hands. He motioned her inside without a word. His apartment smelled of old wood and books, like a library on the verge of falling in on itself. The windows were drawn. The walls were bare. A recliner sat in the middle of the room, next to a dusty table stacked with newspapers and pill bottles. "You found the room?" he asked. Rachel nodded. "You shouldn't have gone back in there alone." "I didn't have a choice." He sat, rubbing his hands together slowly. "They made me keep it clean. After, they said it was just storage. But I saw the scratches. I heard the sounds. There were nights I'd be locking up and I'd hear someone in the floorboards." "Did you know what was happening to the girls?" "I knew enough." His eyes darkened. "Father Raymond and that nurse, they called it therapy. Said it was for the troubled ones. But they were just taking the ones who didn't fall in line. Why didn't you say anything?" "I was the janitor," he said flatly. "I saw things. I kept my head down. That's how I stayed alive." Rachel studied him. "You were back there last night, weren't you?" He didn't answer. "I found your note." "I didn't write that." He looked at her now, and for the first time, there was something like fear in his face. "But I saw someone else out there, in the woods, watching. They weren't part of the school, not in any official capacity." Rachel's voice dropped. "Who?" He hesitated. "I only knew her as Miss Bellamy. She wasn't staff. I think she was brought in from outside, private counselor or something. Came and went at night, always wore gloves, and she never spoke to students in the open, just one-on-one sessions." "Do you know where she is now?" "She was quiet, careful, but not careful enough. She left something behind." He stood, slowly, and shuffled to the corner of the room where an old trunk sat beneath a plastic drop cloth. He opened it and rummaged inside. From it, he withdrew a plastic badge holder. Inside, a faded photo ID. Marjorie Bellamy Greystone Auxiliary Staff. Spring term, 1979 clearance, private sessions. After Vivien disappeared, Merritt said quietly, "I found this in the incinerator chute. Guess she thought it had burned." Rachel took the ID and turned it over. A string of numbers had been scribbled on the back in pen. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. He shook his head. "Maybe a case file, maybe a patient number. But if she's still around, I'll tell you this. She won't want to be found." Rachel slipped the ID into her satchel. "She's going to be." Back in her cottage that night, Rachel uploaded everything to 3 separate cloud accounts and scheduled a second blog post to go live at midnight, just in case. She wrote it fast, fingers flying. There's still someone watching, still someone out there who doesn't want this truth to come out. And now I have her name, Marjorie Bellamy. She was there in 1979. She worked with the girls who disappeared. She called it therapy. But the only thing they were treated for was disobedience. She hit schedule. Then she turned off the lights, checked the locks twice, and went to bed with the pendant, Emiline's pendant, under her pillow. Just in case. Marjorie Bellamy wasn't on social media. There were no Facebook profiles, no LinkedIn entries, no photos tagged by friends or relatives. Her name had disappeared from public records sometime in the early 1990s, just after Greystone closed its doors. But Rachel had the ID, and the number on the back wasn't random. After hours of online digging through court archives and newspaper scans, she found it, buried in a forgotten database of state-issued practitioner licenses from the late 1970s. Bellamy, Marjorie A. License number 44731. Provisional Psychological Counselor issued, February 1978. Suspended, June 1980. Reason, ethical violations. Details unavailable. Last known address, Dover, Vermont. The moment Rachel saw it, she knew. Bellamy hadn't vanished. She'd simply gone underground. It was a 4-hour drive to Dover. Rachel made it in 3.5. She parked in front of a weathered blue house set back from a quiet rural road. Overgrown shrubs flanked the front porch. A rusted mailbox leaned sideways, its flag long gone. The driveway held no car, but smoke drifted from the chimney. She knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. The curtain in the left window shifted slightly. Someone was home. Rachel called through the door. "Ms. Bellamy, my name is Rachel Elwood. I need to talk to you about Greystone Academy." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the door cracked open. The woman who appeared was well into her 80s, dressed in a heavy cardigan and thick wool socks, her white hair pulled back into a bun. Her eyes were pale and unfocused, but they locked onto Rachel with uncanny precision. "Why now?" she said. Rachel's heart skipped. "You know why." Bellamy stepped aside. Inside, the house was surprisingly clean, sparse, quiet, but well kept. A wood-burning stove glowed faintly in the corner. The walls were mostly bare, except for a few water-stained paintings, landscapes, all in shades of gray. "I don't speak of the past," Bellamy said as Rachel stepped inside. "You already did," Rachel replied, and placed the photo ID on the kitchen table. The old woman flinched slightly, like she'd been slapped. "I found the tapes," Rachel added. "I've heard Emiline, I've heard Vivien, I've read the diary, I've seen the wall." Bellamy sat down slowly. "Vivien kept digging," she said, "even after the school told her to stop. Even after the chapel was closed to students. I tried to warn them, you know. I said the girl wasn't stable. Emiline? All of them," she said, almost to herself. "They thought they were stronger than the system. That's the worst kind of mistake." Rachel's pulse quickened. "What was the therapy, Marjorie?" Bellamy looked up sharply. "You think we hurt them?" "I know you did." She studied Rachel for a long time. "We were told they were dangerous. Not criminal, not broken. Just disruptive. They didn't conform. They resisted the rituals, the structure, the prayer groups. Vivien was too quiet. Emiline was imaginative. She said she saw people who weren't there. You drugged them. You isolated them." "We followed orders," Bellamy said, her voice suddenly cold. "We were trained to report deviance, not coddle it." "Deviance?" Rachel echoed. Bellamy's lips curled. "Vivien wrote about you, you know, or someone like you. She said there would always be another one." Rachel's hand hovered near her bag. "I didn't kill anyone," Bellamy said. "No, but you helped bury them." Bellamy's pale eyes narrowed. "And now you want to exhume everything. Dig it up for strangers. What do you think that will accomplish?" Rachel stood. "I think people deserve the truth, especially the ones who didn't survive to speak it." Bellamy said nothing. Rachel turned to leave. "Wait," the old woman said. "There's something I want to give you." Rachel froze. Bellamy moved slowly to a cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer, pulled out a thin black journal, and handed it over. "I kept notes," she said. "Not sanctioned, not official. I wrote them because I had to. I started dreaming about the girls, even after I left. Vivien, Emiline. There was one more too, a third girl. Her name was Delia. No one ever filed her disappearance." Rachel took the journal with shaking hands. "I don't expect forgiveness," Bellamy said. "I know what I did." "You didn't stop them." "I didn't," she admitted. "But I couldn't stop her either." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Her?" Bellamy's eyes went distant. "There was someone above the board. A benefactor, private donor. She came once a month, sat in on evaluations, told us which students had the right temperament for correction. Who? She never gave a real name. Just initials. ER, and she always wore gloves." Rachel stared. "Do you have anything of hers?" Bellamy shook her head. "She never left a trace." Rachel tucked the journal into her satchel. Now she has one. That night, back in Mornington, Rachel sat in her cottage with the journal open across her lap. Bellamy's handwriting was neat and efficient, notes compressed into small margins. March 1st, 1979. Emiline refused again, locked herself in the chapel, screamed when approached, scratched Vivien's name into the wall. Vivien says they spoke in dreams, hallucination or trauma response. Raymond thinks Emiline is destabilizing the others. Suggested full removal. March 4th, Vivien found the ledger. How? She says she told her about the room under the altar, refuses to say who. "There's another one," she says, a third voice. Rachel turned the page. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky pen, "I saw the girl again. Not Emiline, not Vivien. The one in the walls. The one we never named." The sun was barely up when Rachel returned to the chapel. It was sealed. A heavy padlock had been bolted through the front door handles, and a notice stapled across it. Demolition zone. Entry prohibited. But the back trail still existed, the old gardener's path through the woods, overgrown but navigable. She followed it, the black journal clutched to her chest, Bellamy's final entry etched into her mind. "I saw the girl again. Not Emiline, not Vivien. The one in the walls. The one we never named." The chapel door groaned when she pushed it open. The lock had been removed, cut or forced. Someone else had come here recently. Rachel stepped inside and paused. Something had changed. The air was warm, damp, and it smelled of lilacs. Not dust, not decay. Lilacs. The same scent she remembered from one of Vivien's diary entries. She left lilacs by the altar, said they kept the voice calm. Rachel descended the chapel stairs quickly, flashlight in hand. She found the stone room beneath as dark and bare as before. The wall was scrubbed, yes, but the etchings were still faintly visible, like bruises beneath skin. And there, beneath the place where she'd found the box, was something new. A child's drawing, folded, slipped between two loose floor stones. Rachel picked it up and carefully unfolded the paper. Crayon on faded construction stock, drawn with the unsteady hand of a young girl. A stick figure inside a chapel. A wall covered in scribbles, and behind the wall, a second figure, smaller, half-faded, eyes like empty circles. At the bottom of the page, me and her. She lives in the wall. No name. Back at the cottage, Rachel laid the drawing beside Bellamy's journal, Vivien's diary, and the tapes. Each thread had led her closer, but they weren't converging on Emiline or even Vivien anymore. They were converging on someone else. A third girl, a lost file, a student who was never enrolled. No photo, no signature. She called Jeanette at town hall. Can you check the intake logs again? Rachel asked. Look for any names that were withdrawn before the semester started, or any students who were placed at Greystone off record. Jeanette sighed. That's not how it works, Rachel. If they weren't enrolled, they're not in the system. What about ghost entries? Jeanette paused. Ghost entries? You know, placeholder files, used when a name's omitted or the records are sealed. There was a long silence on the line. Then, give me an hour. The call came 40 minutes later. Jeanette's voice was tight, clipped. I found one. Rachel sat up straight. What's the name? There isn't one. It's a blank file, just a number. GS794-C. No photo, no parental info, no room assignment, but it's listed as restricted session participant, same program code as Emiline's. Rachel's blood ran cold. That's her. The file is dated January 6th, 1979, same week Emiline started her therapy sessions. Where's the file now? Pulled, Jeanette said. Archived to off-site storage, and you'll love this. The request to archive it was made in 1983 by someone named E. Rutherford Rachel Froze. E.R., she whispered. The benefactor. The woman Bellamy described. The one above the board. Can you get me the storage address? Rachel asked. I can try, but be careful, Rachel. If this woman's real and still alive, she's been one step ahead this whole time. I know, Rachel said. That's why I'm going to catch up. The record storage facility sat in an industrial park on the edge of town. 3 acres of beige concrete boxes and humming lights. Rachel signed in at the front desk, flashed her temporary research credentials, and was escorted to a climate-controlled room with 6 rows of shelving that stretched to the ceiling. Boxes tagged GS794-C, the clerk said. But we don't open sealed government records. You'll need written approval for access. Rachel nodded politely. Of course. The moment the clerk left, she moved fast. She found the shelf, middle row, box 794-C, locked, padlocked. But she noticed the corner of the lid had been recently disturbed. A torn seal, adhesive fresh. Someone else had already looked inside. Rachel retrieved her lockpick set, the one she kept for crate emergencies, or so she told herself, and went to work. 30 seconds later, the lock clicked. She opened the lid. Inside, a single manila folder. She opened it slowly. Redacted student case file, GS794-C. Subject was placed in care under donor-funded initiative for cognitive rehabilitation. Behavioral profile. Withdrawn, nonverbal, drawn to chapel location. Found creating patterns in basement walls. Subject denied access to all common areas. Staff directive. Isolate. Record. Observe. Subject name. Redacted. Status. Facility death. Unrecorded. Recommendation. No formal record. No burial record. Mark as facility loss and suppress. Rachel stared at the words. Facility death. Unrecorded. There had been a third girl, and they had erased her entire existence. On the last page was a photo, not a school portrait, just a blurry surveillance shot. Black and white. A girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, standing at the edge of a shadowed corridor, eyes wide, staring at the camera. No name, just a piece of tape across the bottom. The Silent One. Rachel backed away from the box. This was the girl Vivien dreamed of. The girl Bellamy feared. The one Emiline whispered about in her final sessions. And she'd been locked in the chapel long before Vivien or Emiline ever got there. That night, Rachel uploaded her findings to every outlet she could reach. Local news, national missing persons databases, and her blog. She titled the post, The Girl Who Wasn't There. Inside it, she included everything. The sealed file, the unnamed photo, the archive directive to suppress, Bellamy's journal, Vivien's sketches, the crayon drawing. She ended with one line. Someone erased her name. I won't. Then she hit publish. She sat in the silence of her cottage for a long time. At 3:14 a.m., her phone buzzed. No number, just one message. You should stop digging. Some names are meant to stay buried. Rachel stared at the screen, then typed back, "Not this one." The fallout came fast. Within 24 hours of Rachel's blog post about the silent one, local reporters showed up in Mornington. National outlets followed. A crime podcast released a special episode called The Girl Without a File. And suddenly the school board, the same one that had tried to ignore her, was panicking. They issued a rushed statement. "We are aware of newly surfaced materials involving undocumented student cases at Greystone Academy. An independent review panel will be established. We extend our sympathy to the families affected." But there were no families listed, because the girl in the photo, the silent one, had no official name. Jeanette called the next day. Someone broke into the records room. Rachel felt her stomach drop. What did they take? Nothing, technically. But all files related to GS794-C were accessed. And the digital backup? Deleted. Who has clearance? Only 3 people, and I'm one of them. Rachel's voice was tight. Who's the third? Jeanette hesitated. Eleanor Rutherford. Rachel nearly dropped the phone. She's still on the board? She never left, Jeanette said. She doesn't attend meetings, but she signs the checks. Quiet power. Rachel's fingers clenched around the armrest. She's ER. She always has been. Rachel had known this would come eventually. The face behind the curtain. The one who had orchestrated it all. The therapy, the isolation, the erased student. But knowing her name wasn't enough. She needed proof. She needed something Eleanor couldn't explain away. So Rachel did the only thing she could think of. She went back to Greystone. It was just past midnight when she arrived, flashlight in hand, satchel slung over her shoulder. The fog rolled low across the grass. The chapel doors were still sealed with yellow warning tape, but someone had already sliced through it. Inside, the air felt charged, like it remembered her. She walked down the narrow staircase to the stone room below. This time, she wasn't looking for what had been buried. She was looking for what had been missed. She tapped along the far wall with the handle of the flashlight, listening for hollows. Then she heard it, a different echo. Slight, subtle. She knelt and pressed her ear to the stone. Silence. Then, faintly, breathing. Rachel froze. It was impossible. But there it was again. Not wind, not plumbing, breathing. She stood, heart racing, and examined the wall closely. There, beneath the lowest row of bricks, was a faint seam. She reached into her bag for the crowbar. The stone gave way more easily than expected. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, low, dry, and pitch black. She pushed her flashlight inside and saw it, a room. Smaller than the others, almost a cell. Inside, a child's mattress, a broken doll, a chain still bolted to the wall and carved into the stone thousands of times in desperate, jagged script. "I'm here! I'm here! I'm here!" Rachel stepped back, throat tight. The girl hadn't just been isolated. She'd been imprisoned, and no one came for her. Then she heard it again. Not breathing. Footsteps above her, heavy, deliberate. Someone else was in the chapel. Rachel backed into the crawl space and pulled the stone shut behind her, leaving just a sliver open. She turned off her flashlight and held her breath. The footsteps descended slowly. They paused at the bottom of the stairs. Then a voice echoed across the room. Cool, refined, and terrifyingly calm. "Miss Elwood, I know you're here." Rachel's pulse hammered in her throat. "You've caused quite the mess. Misunderstood things, made assumptions." The footsteps moved closer to the wall. "You were never meant to find the file. That girl, she was never meant to be found, because she was never part of the school. She was a donation." A donation. Rachel felt bile rise in her throat. Some truths are heavier than others. What would you gain from exposing this? Do you think people want to know that a child lived in the dark while they prayed upstairs? The woman paused. "They'll thank me one day." for keeping it hidden. Rachel couldn't stop herself. She shoved the stone aside and stepped out. Eleanor Rutherford stood in the middle of the room, gray-haired, regal, wrapped in a black coat like a widow in mourning. But her eyes were sharp, unapologetic. Rachel spoke, her voice shaking but loud. "I know what you did." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Then you know what I'm capable of." Police sirens wailed in the distance. Rachel didn't smile, but her eyes didn't leave Eleanor's. "Good. Then you know they're on the way." The police arrived within minutes. Eleanor Rutherford didn't resist. She said nothing as they handcuffed her, her face as smooth and still as marble. As if even now, in the middle of collapse, she believed herself untouchable. Rachel gave the lead officer the file from storage, the photos, and her own recording of Eleanor's voice, captured by a small microphone she'd clipped inside her coat pocket. That girl, she was never meant to be found, because she was never part of the school. She was a donation. That line echoed through the precinct and the courthouse over the weeks that followed. It made headlines. It broke trust. It changed Mornington forever. Within days of Eleanor's arrest, investigators uncovered a private ledger hidden in a locked drawer of her estate. Inside, coded references to payments, special placements, and psychological handling procedures. More girls had passed through Greystone's stone walls than the school had ever admitted. Some were relocated, some disappeared. A few had no names at all. The public outcry forced the Mornington Educational Trust to dissolve. The land Greystone sat on was seized by the state, pending further investigation. Demolition was indefinitely halted. And then came the task of remembrance. Rachel stood in the center of the chapel on a bright spring morning. The press wasn't there. No cameras, no speeches. Just her, Jeanette, Margaret Harker, Ruth Locke, and a simple plaque being placed in the stone room below. In memory of the unnamed. She didn't run. She didn't forget. We remember. Vivien Locke's sketch of the chapel hung above it, framed behind glass. The drawing of the girl in the wall, left behind in crayon, was displayed beside it. No longer lost, no longer silent. Weeks later, Rachel published the full story in print, a long-form exposé titled "The Girl Who Wasn't on the Roster." It appeared in national magazines, academic journals, podcasts, and eventually school psychology textbooks. She didn't hide any part of it. Not Vivien's fear, not Emiline's fate, not Bellamy's complicity or Rutherford's control. Because truth, Rachel knew now, is only as powerful as your willingness to share it. And silence had buried enough girls. On the final page of her book, Rachel included an excerpt from Vivien's last known letter, never mailed, folded between the pages of a novel in her belongings. If someone finds this, please don't forget her. Not the one in the photo, the one in the wall. She was small, quiet, always watching. She never said a word, but she was louder than all of us. Her name was never spoken, so I gave her one. I called her Hope. 1 year later, the Greystone grounds reopened as a state historical site. The chapel remained intact, now lined with panels detailing the truth. Visitors came quietly, often with daughters. On the altar sat a small bronze statue, a girl with closed eyes, one hand against the wall, listening. Beneath it, one word was etched. Hope, and Rachel, finally, was able to sleep again. Not because the ghosts had gone, but because someone was finally listening. Please subscribe if you like this story.